The second case we're going to look at is Poundland and Top Lane. It's another COVID-19 case, and it also involves the Landlord and Tenants Act 1954. Background is as follows. The case was focused on the non-contested lease renewal under Part 2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act. Poundland's lease renewal at its store in Twickenham was unopposed. The parties had reached an agreement on an annual rent of £130,000 for a new lease with a 5-year term. They had also agreed that there would be no break clause. However, the tenant wanted to alter the existing lease further by seeking the inclusion of a pandemic rent suspension clause, which would reduce the rent and service charge payable by 50% if there was a government-imposed lockdown. Poundland also sought to try and disallow the landlord from ending the lease during any lockdown period. The landlord resisted this on the basis that there was no market precedent for it. The landlord also argued that it would change the relationship between the parties. So, what are the facts then? So, in this situation, it's really up to the tenant to demonstrate that it's fair and reasonable in the circumstances to impose a change. The principle comes from a case that many of you will already be aware of, O'May and City of London Real Property Company. The case basically sets out that any change needs to be reasonable in modernising the lease. Poundland therefore argued that the insertion of the pandemic clauses was a reasonable modernisation and relied on another recent case, the one we just talked about, W.H. Smith. Poundland argued that if it could not trade, it would be a risk to the landlord as it would not be able to pay the rents that are owed under the lease. So what did the court decide? Well, the judge didn't agree with that argument. The judge accepted the landlord's argument instead, that there was no market precedent for pandemic clauses to be routinely incorporated into a lease renewal. The judge illustrated how that was different to the W.H. Smith case on the basis that in W.H. Smith, the parties had already agreed the principle to include the pandemic provision. And it was for courts to decide when that actually kicked in, the trigger. Here, there was no such principle agreement between the parties on the actual inclusion of the clause itself. The court held that the inclusion of the pandemic clause would fundamentally change the relationship between the landlord and tenant. The court felt it was unfair for a tenant's short-term commercial risks to be passed on to a landlord when the landlord has a longer-term investment risk.